Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out. Today we're talking about three tiny words. Three incredibly common words. And honestly, three words that completely change the way you sound in English. Not just grammatically, but socially, emotionally, even professionally. Today's episode is about could, would, and should. And I think this is one of those topics that almost every English learner understands a little, but never feels completely comfortable using naturally. Because technically, most learners know the basic meanings. Could, dollar, possibility, would, die, das, conditional, should, I, advice. Right? But then real life happens, and suddenly you're in a meeting, or at a cafe, or writing an email, or talking to someone at work, and your brain freezes for half a second. Like, wait, should I say can or could here? Would sounds more polite, right? Is should too strong? Why does this sentence sound weird? And that tiny hesitation, that tiny moment of uncertainty, that's exactly what we're going to fix today.
Yeah, and honestly, this is one of those topics where learners usually think, I have a grammar problem. But most of the time, it's not grammar, it's tone, it's social feeling, it's understanding how English speakers soften things, how they sound respectful, how they sound collaborative, how they avoid sounding too direct. Because in English, the words you choose completely change the emotional energy of a sentence.
Exactly. And what's interesting is, native speakers are constantly using these words. At work, in restaurants, in relationships, in emails, in customer service, in business meetings. They're everywhere. But people are not usually thinking, yes, now I will use a modal verb. They're thinking about politeness, emotion, distance, softness, confidence, pressure, intention. And that's the real key.
Let's imagine a very simple situation. You walk into a coffee shop. The person at the counter smiles and says, "What can I get for you?" And you answer, "I want a coffee." Now, is that grammatically wrong? No. Will people understand you? Of course. But does it sound natural? Not really.
Yeah. And this is where things become really interesting. Because nothing is technically incorrect, but emotionally. The sentence feels too direct, too hard, almost aggressive. And learners usually feel this instinctively. You say it, and something inside your brain goes, that sounded strange.
Exactly. Now compare that with, I'd like a coffee. Could I get a coffee? I would love a coffee. Suddenly, the entire feeling changes. Same coffee, same situation, same intention, but completely different energy.
And that's the central idea of today's episode, because this is not really about grammar rules. It's about social meaning. It's about understanding how English softens communication, how politeness works, how indirect language creates comfort, and why native speakers rarely sound extremely direct.
Yeah, and once you understand this, a lot of English suddenly starts making more sense, especially professional English, because these words act almost like emotional filters. They change pressure, confidence, politeness, certainty, authority, sometimes with just one word.
Actually, I think there's a really good way to visualize this. Imagine English communication like clothing.
Oh, I like where this is going already.
Okay, imagine very direct English is like wearing sweatpants and flip-flops. Comfortable, simple, very direct. Like, open the door. Send me the file. I want coffee.
Yeah, functional, but maybe a little too intense in certain situations.
Exactly. Now imagine could, would, should as layers that make your English smoother, more elegant, more professional, more socially intelligent, not fake, just softer.
Yeah, it's like the difference between give me the report and could you send me the report when you have a moment? Same objective, completely different feeling. And honestly, this is one of the biggest differences between beginner English and natural English. Beginners usually focus on vocabulary accuracy, but advanced speakers focus on emotional accuracy. How does this sentence feel? That's the real question.
Exactly. Because fluency is not just saying correct words, it's understanding. Pressure, softness, intention, emotional tone. And these three words are absolutely central to that. So in this episode, we're going to explore how could softens requests, how would changes desire and intention, how should gives advice without sounding aggressive, why direct English sometimes sounds rude, and how native speakers naturally make communication feel lighter.
We'll look at work situations, meetings, cafes, friendships, professional conversations, common mistakes, and side-by-side comparisons that completely change the feeling of a sentence. And by the end of this episode, you won't just understand these words intellectually.
You'll start feeling them. And honestly, that changes everything.
All right, so let's start with the first word, and probably the one that immediately makes your English sound more polite.
Because once you understand this one, you'll start hearing it everywhere.
All right, so let's start with could. And honestly, this is probably one of the easiest ways to immediately sound more natural in English, not more advanced academically, more human socially, because could lives in the world of politeness, softness, emotional space, and native speakers use it constantly.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that learners often think could is complicated because they learn things like past ability, conditional possibility, hypothetical situations, and suddenly the word feels heavy. But in real life, most of the time, could is just emotional softening. That's the real thing happening. So let's compare something very simple. Imagine you're working in an office. You need your coworker to send you a file. You say, "Send me the file." Now, is that grammatically correct? Yes. But emotionally, it feels hard.
Yeah, it sounds like pressure authority command, like you're giving orders, especially if your tone is flat.
Now compare that with, "Could you send me the file?" Suddenly, the whole atmosphere changes. And what's fascinating is the action is identical. You still want the file. But emotionally, you gave the other person space.
And this is something really important in English culture, especially American English. Native speakers often avoid sounding too direct, even when they absolutely need something. So instead of, "Help me," they say, "Could you help me?" Instead of, "Open the window," they say, "Could you open the window?" And after a while, your brain stops hearing this as grammar. It just becomes normal human interaction.
Let's imagine a real situation. You're new at a company. First week. You don't know people very well yet. You walk over to someone's desk and say, "Print this for me." Oof. That feels uncomfortable immediately.
Yeah, even if the person is nice, internally they might think, "Wow, okay," because emotionally, there's no softness there, no social cushion.
Exactly. Now imagine, "Hey, could you print this for me when you have a second?" That feels collaborative, friendly, professional. And notice something important. When you have a second. Native speakers add these little softeners constantly, not because they're weak, because smooth communication matters.
Actually, one thing advanced English learners notice eventually is this. Natural English is often less direct than translated English, and that's why some perfectly correct sentences sound strange. Not because the grammar is wrong, but because the emotional tone feels too strong.
And there's another important layer here. Could often removes pressure. For example, "Can you help me?" Sounds normal, but "Could you help me?" feels slightly more considerate, slightly softer, slightly less demanding.
Yeah, it's almost like, "I know you have your own life. I know you're busy. I respect your space." And that emotional feeling matters a lot in English, especially professionally. Let's go back to the coffee shop for a second, because this is where learners hear these patterns all the time. Imagine the barista asks, "What can I get started for you?" And you answer, "Give me a latte." Again, not grammatically wrong, but emotionally too hard.
Yeah, it sounds almost cinematic. like a stressed movie character.
Exactly. Laughs. Now compare. Could I get a latte? Could I have a latte? I'd like a latte. That sounds smooth, relaxed, socially natural.
And this is a really useful pattern. Could I? Because now you're not commanding anyone. You're opening a polite interaction. For example, could I ask you something? Could I use your charger? Could I sit here? Could I get a coffee? These sound extremely natural.
Yeah, and honestly, if learners only mastered this one pattern, their English would instantly sound more comfortable socially, because native speakers use this structure constantly.
Okay, let's imagine another situation. You're in a meeting. Your manager is explaining something quickly. You missed part of it. Now, a lot of learners panic here because they want clarification, but they don't want to interrupt aggressively.
Exactly. So instead of, repeat that, you say, could you repeat that? Could you explain that again? Could you go over that one more time? And immediately, you sound calm, professional, collaborative. And honestly, this is why politeness in English is deeply connected to fluency, because advanced speakers don't just communicate information, they manage emotional energy. That's a huge part of sounding natural.
Yeah. And I think learners sometimes underestimate this. They think fluency means speaking faster, but a lot of fluency is actually making people feel comfortable talking to you, and could helps do that beautifully. Now, before we continue, let's make one thing really clear, because learners ask this all the time.
Yeah. What's the difference between can and could?
And honestly, in many everyday situations, both are possible, but they feel different emotionally.
Exactly. Very generally, can laksax direct, jut neutral, could dajwas softer, jatjas more polite. So, can you help me? Sounds normal, but could you help me? Sounds more respectful, more socially careful.
Imagine your boss says, "Can you come to my office?" That feels serious already. Now imagine, "Could you come to my office for a moment?" Much softer, same action, different emotional atmosphere.
And this is important. Soft English does not mean weak English. A lot of learners think, if I soften everything, I sound insecure. But native speakers soften communication constantly, especially confident professionals, because sounding aggressive all the time creates tension.
Exactly. Actually, very confident people often sound calmer and softer, not louder, and could is part of that communication style. So if we simplify everything about could, soft requests, politeness, emotional space, respect, lower pressure.
Yeah. And instead of thinking, could means it grammar rule, try thinking, could means smoother human interaction. That mindset changes everything. All right. So now that we understand how could softens requests, let's move to another word that completely changes how your desires sound in English.
Because this next one is everywhere. Restaurants, meetings, relationships, emails, customer service. And honestly, without it, English can sound surprisingly hard. All right, so now let's move into would. And honestly, this is probably one of the most powerful words in polite English, because while could softens requests, would softens desire, and that changes everything socially.
Yeah, because humans are emotional about desire. The moment you say, I want, the energy changes immediately. It becomes direct, strong, heavy, sometimes even unintentionally aggressive. And this is something almost every English learner experiences at some point. You walk into a cafe, or a restaurant, or a hotel, and you say, I want water, I want coffee, I want a table. And again, people understand you perfectly, but emotionally, it sounds harder than you intended.
Yeah, and I think learners often feel confused here because, in many languages, direct desire sounds normal, natural. But in English, native speakers usually soften desire automatically, especially with strangers. especially in professional situations, especially in customer service environments. Let's imagine something simple. You sit down at a nice restaurant. The waiter walks over smiling and says, "Are you ready to order?" You look at him and say, "I want steak." Again, not incorrect. But emotionally, it lands very directly.
Yeah, it almost sounds like demand, urgency, expectation. Even if you're a super nice person, that's the interesting part. The grammar isn't rude. The emotional tone is just too strong for the situation.
Now compare that with, "I'd like the steak." "I would like the steak." "I'd like a coffee." Everything softens instantly. And honestly, this is one of the most important patterns in spoken English.
Yeah, because would like creates emotional distance, not cold distance, polite distance, and that distance feels respectful. Actually, I think a really good way to think about this is want feels emotional and immediate. Would like feels thoughtful and controlled. That's why professionals use it constantly.
Exactly. And native speakers often don't consciously think about this anymore. It's automatic. You go to Starbucks, you say, "I'd like a latte." You call a hotel, "I'd like to make a reservation." You email someone, "I'd like to discuss the project." This pattern is everywhere.
Let's imagine a workplace situation. You need to speak with your manager privately. Now imagine you say, "I want to talk to you." Oof, that sounds intense immediately.
Yeah, your manager instantly thinks, "Oh no, what happened?" Because emotionally, it sounds heavy, almost confrontational.
Exactly. Now compare. "I'd like to talk to you when you have a moment." That feels calm, professional, respectful, and emotionally safe.
Honestly, that's one of the best ways to describe these words. They change the emotional temperature of communication, and advanced English speakers do this constantly, without even noticing. Now let's look at another really important use of would offers, because native speakers use would all the time when offering things politely.
Yeah, especially, "Would you like?" That structure is incredibly common. For example, "Would you like some coffee?" "Would you like some help?" "Would you like to join us?" "Would you like another minute?" These sound warm, welcoming, professional.
Imagine someone comes to your house. You don't say, "Do you want coffee?" I mean, you can. But, "Would you like some coffee?" feels softer, more caring, more elegant socially.
Yeah, and this is really subtle, because native speakers often communicate care through softness, not through dramatic words. Tiny changes create huge emotional differences. Actually, one thing that surprises many learners is this: polite English is often indirect English, and indirect English is not dishonest. It's cooperative. It creates comfort. That's the deeper social logic behind these words.
Okay, imagine your coworker looks overwhelmed. They have papers everywhere. Their laptop is open. They look stressed. Now compare these two versions. "Do you want help?" "Would you like some help?" Second one feels much more supportive.
Default text exactly. The first one sounds functional. The second one sounds emotionally aware. And honestly, that emotional awareness is a huge part of natural English conversation. And if you listen carefully in business English, you hear would constantly. For example, "I'd like to discuss a few ideas." "We'd like to schedule a meeting." "I'd like your opinion on this." "Would you be available tomorrow?" "Would it be possible to?" This is the language of professional softness.
Yeah, because professional English is rarely aggressive. Strong professionals usually sound calm, clear, collaborative, and would helps create that tone beautifully. So let's simplify this really clearly. "I want coffee." Direct desire. "I'd like coffee." Polite desire. "I want a meeting." Heavy, direct. "I'd like to schedule a meeting." Professional, softer.
And again, this is not about right or wrong. It's about emotional effect. That's the real conversation happening underneath the grammar. Actually, I think would is almost like an elevator for social tone. Without it, your English stays very literal, but once you start using it naturally, everything sounds smoother, more polished, more emotionally intelligent.
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes learners think native speakers sound naturally elegant. But a lot of that elegance comes from these tiny softening structures, not from difficult vocabulary. Let's compare something very realistic. Imagine writing an email. Version 1, I want more information. Very direct. Now version 2, I'd like some more information. That already sounds dramatically more professional.
Yeah, and in corporate environments. These tiny tone adjustments matter a lot because communication is not just information, it's relationship management. So if we simplify everything about would, soft desire, polite intention, elegant requests, respectful offers, emotional control.
Yeah, and honestly, once learners start using would naturally, their English suddenly sounds much more adult, much more professional, much more socially fluid.
All right, so now we've explored could for soft requests, would for soft desire. Now let's move to the last one. And this one is incredibly important because it changes advice.
Yeah, because there's a huge difference between helping someone and sounding like you're giving orders. And this word lives exactly in that space.
All right, so now let's talk about should. And honestly, this word is much more emotional than most learners realize, because should is not really about grammar. It's about guidance. It's about helping someone without controlling them. And native speakers use this balance constantly.
Yeah, because advice is socially delicate. The moment you tell someone what to do, you enter emotional territory. And if you sound too direct, people become defensive immediately, even if your intention is good. Let's imagine a situation. Your friend looks exhausted. They haven't slept well in days. They're stressed, overworked. You look at them and say, take a break. Now, again, grammatically, perfect. Emotionally, a little hard.
Yeah, depending on your tone, it can sound like authority, command, impatience, like you're telling the person what to do.
Exactly. Now compare. You should take a break. Completely different feeling. Now it feels caring, supportive, thoughtful. The pressure drops immediately.
And this is the key emotional feeling of should. Guidance without force. You're saying, I think this is a good idea, not, you must do this. That difference matters a lot. Imagine your friend says, I've been working non-stop all week. Now compare these responses. Rest. You should rest. Second one feels human.
Yeah, the first one sounds almost military. The second one sounds compassionate. And honestly, this is why native speakers use should constantly in emotional conversations. I think this is important. Should does not control people, at least not usually. It suggests, guides, recommends. The final decision still belongs to the other person, and that's why it feels respectful. Let's imagine a team meeting. The project is stuck. Nobody agrees on the next step. One person says, we need a decision. Okay, fair. But now compare, we should make a decision today. That feels smoother, more cooperative, more team-oriented.
Exactly, because should often reduces confrontation, and that's one reason it's so socially useful.
Actually, a lot of natural English is about reducing social friction. That's what these words do. They soften demands, criticism, disagreement, advice, desire, and communication becomes easier because of that.
Imagine your friend says, I feel tired all the time lately. Now compare. You must sleep more. You should sleep more. Second one sounds caring. First one sounds intense.
Yeah, must creates pressure. Should creates guidance. That's the emotional difference.
And honestly, tone changes everything with should. You can sound warm, professional, gentle, concerned, collaborative, all with the same structure. For example, you should talk to your manager can sound supportive or serious or protective, depending on the context.
Imagine a coworker sitting quietly after a difficult meeting. They look frustrated. You sit beside them and say, "You should talk to the director about this." That feels supportive. Like, "You deserve help." Not, "I'm commanding you." And that emotional layer matters a lot. Another really common use of should is self-reflection. Native speakers say things like, "I should exercise more," "I should call my parents," "I should go to bed earlier." And interestingly, these sentences are soft even toward yourself.
Yeah, it's not. "I must change my entire life immediately." It's more like, "I know this would probably be good for me." That softness exists even internally. And honestly, the more you listen to native speakers, the more you notice this pattern. English constantly softens emotional force, especially in everyday conversation, and should is a huge part of that system. So if we simplify everything about should, advice, guidance, soft recommendations, emotional support, lower pressure.
Yeah, and maybe the best way to describe it is, should helps people without pushing people. And that's why it sounds so natural in English.
All right, so now we've explored all three words separately: could, would, should. But now comes the really interesting part.
Because in real life, your brain needs to choose between them quickly. And that's where everything starts to connect.
All right, so before we finish, let's zoom out for a second. Because today was not really about memorizing grammar rules. And honestly, I think that's one of the most important things to understand.
Yeah, because if you look at everything we explored today, coffee shops, meetings, friendships, emails, relationships, work conversations, the real topic underneath all of it was emotional communication, not grammar charts, not complicated formulas. So let's simplify everything one last time. Could softens requests, would softens desire and offers, should softens advice.
And what connects all three? They reduce emotional pressure. That's the big pattern. Because natural English often tries to sound collaborative, respectful, emotionally balanced, especially in everyday interaction. And honestly, I think this is where many learners suddenly level up, because they stop asking, "What does this word mean?" and start asking, "How does this sentence feel?" That's a huge shift.
Exactly. Because fluency is not just producing correct sentences, it's understanding. Tone, pressure, warmth, politeness, emotional effect. That's what makes someone sound natural. So here's a very practical tip. If your English ever feels too hard, too direct, too intense, try softening the sentence with could, would, or should a lot of the time. That's exactly what native speakers are doing.
For example, instead of "help me," try "could you help me?" Instead of "I want coffee," try "I'd like a coffee." Instead of "talk to your manager," try "you should talk to your manager." Tiny changes, huge emotional difference. And honestly, once you start noticing these patterns in movies, podcasts, interviews, TV shows, work meetings, you realize native speakers use these structures constantly. Not because they're trying to sound fancy, because this is simply how natural English manages social interaction.
And I think this is actually really beautiful about language. Because communication is not just about exchanging information, it's also about making people feel comfortable, showing care, reducing tension, creating connection. And these tiny words do that constantly.
So maybe the biggest idea from today is this: advanced English is often softer English.
Yeah, not weaker, softer. And there's a big difference between those two things.
All right, that's it for today. Honestly, this was one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, because this topic changes the way people experience your English emotionally. And that's huge. So before we go, we want to hear from you. What's one sentence you usually say directly that you could soften with could, would, or should?
Yeah, write it in the comments. and try transforming a request, a piece of advice, or something you normally say with I want into softer, natural English. And honestly, don't worry about being perfect. The goal is not perfect grammar. The goal is becoming more emotionally natural in English. That's the real skill.
And if this episode helped you, share it with someone who still says, I want coffee.
And don't forget to subscribe for real English
Real conversations.
and real progress. See you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.